in the 20th chapter of the book of Acts, where we are resuming our study. It chronicles Paul's third missionary journey. It's this trip he's on to visit the churches he had already planted. And what happened? Something happened. Did he say something funny? Oh, that thing. Yeah. Yeah, no, good. That's the, yeah, there's the title for you. Yeah. Not here? Yeah, we'll see. Okay. So what we did, we left off with the riots in Ephesus. If you remember, were a stadium full of idol worshipers and idol makers. They were protesting, actually, they were in fear that their lucrative business was going down because so many people were coming to Christ because of Paul's ministry and the faithful ministry of the believers in Ephesus. And more people in Ephesus no longer needed to buy or worship some ancient replica of Artemis. Remember who Artemis was? That was one of the many pagan gods back in the day. And this was this multi-breasted, that's what it was, is a female god that had a whole bunch of those things, mammary glands on it. And they all worshiped it. Isn't it amazing that societies could worship sexuality? Yeah. Out of everything it could worship, why does it worship that? We could talk about that on another occasion, because I've got an answer for you. But I do want to remind you that God made the first two people, and then we make the rest. And it is that mechanism that creates eternal beings. And in that way, in that act, the sex act, we become co-creators with God. Right? We've talked about this before. Amazing. So the enemy always tries to twist and warp the things that God has made, make it perverse. So, nothing new. So we find in verse 1 of chapter 20 what followed. Verse 1, after the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them and saying farewell, he left for Macedonia. In other words, when things got back to normal, Paul called together those that had come to Christ there in Ephesus to cheer them on. Hey, keep up the good work there in Ephesus. And no matter how mad these idol worshipers get at you, you just keep spreading the gospel, because some of them, they're going to receive Jesus. They're going to receive what you have to say. Their lives will change. You will change them for eternity. Their eternal destination will change if they believe what you're saying. So after he says his goodbyes, he heads to Macedonia, which was when and where he wrote 2 Corinthians. And he tells us that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. Verse 2. When Paul had gone through those regions and had given the believers much encouragement, he came to Greece, where he stayed for 3 months. And what this means was that as Paul traveled, he went from one gathering to the next, giving constant encouraging, lifting up their spirits, charging these Christians up. And during this time, we also understand it's when he wrote his letter to the Romans. It's what the letter in your Bible that follows this one here, Acts, then Romans. Now, you can imagine how his visits and his experience in teaching and encouraging believers in God's truth would help him get his own theology down in order for him to write what he wrote in Romans, which is the most comprehensive theological letter we have. It's the greatest explanation of the good news. And the Spirit of God inspired the writing of Romans, but as we know, God takes us through experiences so that our understanding of truth becomes very clear. And anybody who is authored understands this principle. Verse 3, he was about to sail for Syria when a plot was made against him by the Jews. And so he decided to return through Macedonia. Now, perhaps they were going to assassinate him on board the ship. Paul would just simply have disappeared overboard. And as we've been seeing in the book of Acts, Paul's life was filled with this kind of thing. He was repeatedly persecuted. He was beaten. He was jailed. And he experienced opposition almost everywhere he preached the gospel of Jesus. And he also had to deal with the mental and the emotional anguish that resulted almost everywhere he preached the gospel of Jesus. But Paul, he not only had to deal with the physical attacks, the emotional attacks. Imagine the spiritual attacks. You know, because when the devil comes after you, he comes after you in many ways. And he really wants to mess with your mind. He comes after your spirit. He comes after your soul. Well, Paul not only made it through trial after trial, but he didn't lose heart. You know, when any of us go through difficult times in ministry, there's a tendency to lose heart. Paul, being very familiar with that in his own battles, he wrote a remedy for us. You want to hear it? Therefore, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart, but we have this treasure in clay jars, he says. Pretty fragile. I mean, crack pretty easy. Okay, right. You don't do that, Tony says. We have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be visible in our bodies. That would be the treasure. The life of Jesus is inside of you. Amen. And he's indestructible. In other words, you know, there are times when we could get the feeling that ministry is actually punishment. Rather, it's God's kindness and his love for us that gives us a piece of the action. Yes. He could do it all by himself. That's right. I mean, does God need your help? No. But in some strange, mysterious sovereignty of God, he decided to limit himself to our speed. He could save the world like this. But he doesn't, because his plan is to use us. However slowly we do it. And when you I finally do what God calls us to do, the enemy is going to be upset, and that'll be quite clear in the response of other people who are still lost, who still belong to the enemy. They're not going to like you and me. So even though we're fragile, like one of the clay vessels that they had in the day, we crack when dropped or kicked or abused. We still have something within us that's invisible and unbreakable. It's the Superman stuff. You know these words from Paul, you know where they come from? They're found in 2 Corinthians 4 that I told you earlier. He was writing from this area. Now, do you ever feel that you may not be able to keep it together? That you're losing heart? I want to read you something from the late, great David Wilkerson. Somebody that Pastor Walter and I like a whole lot. 1 year after 9/11, 2002, he said this. See if I can read it. I'm playing trombone in my old age. It's okay. You're sweet. How could God's people obtain and maintain joy and gladness when facing a society full of stress, worry, and fear? Look around you. What do you see? You see what the prophet Isaiah saw in his day when ungodly nations reeled under the divine shaking of all things. He saw proud nations trembling because of desolation falling on all sides. It was when Isaiah said, "Gladness is taken away and joy out of the plentiful field, and in the vineyards there shall be no singing." Chapter 16, verse 10. Right now, stress and anxiety are mounting. Masses around the world fear some kind of nuclear or biological terrorism. And in sinful societies, gladness and joy are being taken away, and in their place follow a false peace, shallow giddiness, and party-induced highs. Yet it all ends in an indescribable downer within hours. True joy and gladness are found only in Jesus. Hear me well. After 9/11 and the fall of the Twin Towers, people flocked to churches that only lasted about 6 months before the religious fervor passed away. People said the churches were dead, boring, and the preacher had nothing to say to help them. Now, church attendance is less than it was prior to 9/11. Let me tell you what is going to happen immediately after the next frightening event, after the next world-shaking act of terror. Forget about the churches. They'll be shunned. Instead, the masses are going to turn to any kind of drug or pleasure to narcotize themselves. We'll see the benumbing of America through sexual behavior and pleasure madness beyond imagination. The cry will be, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." People will shut out all bad news. They will abhor any spiritual warnings or talk about judgment. Already in most European countries, it is possible to buy numbing medications without a prescription. And in America, prescribed narcotics are numbing the minds of millions of stressed out people. The good news is that God will have a people whose minds are stayed on him. For those, the prophecy is, quote, "The work of righteousness shall be peace, and the effect of righteousness, quietness, and assurance forever." Isaiah 32:17. He could have written that today. The critical thing in this Christian life, according to Paul, was not to lose heart. The conflicts and the adversities that we face are very real. Friends, the fear and uncertainty in our nation and in our world are very real. We've talked about it. We're preparing for it. I believe my Bible that eventually a generation is going to experience some really tough stuff. Really tough. Generations do already, and throughout human history, there's been some horrific moments, and not just decades, but centuries that human beings have had to endure. But one is coming that's worse than all of those combined. And so losing hearts is a clear and present danger for everybody today. But we as Christians must not give in. We cannot afford to become weary of doing good, as Paul tells us in Galatians 6:9. And we must all the more press into time with God in that Bible, in prayer, to find new strength so that we will never tire of doing what is right, Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 3:13. Because today is a unique moment, and I trust, for spiritual harvest. that when things get scary, people often look up, like they did at 9/11. Paul kept going with one thing on his mind, and that was to make new converts and to strengthen the existing believers. And the Lord wants to ask you this morning that if he could encourage and gird up the Apostle Paul, what can he do for you? One thing that he does is he sends in reinforcements. And from verses 4 to 6, we read the list of men who accompanied Paul. Here's the reinforcements. Ready? Paul was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, by Aristarchus and Secundas from Thessalonica, by Gaius from Derbe, and by Timothy, as well as by Tychicus, Trophimus from Asia. They went ahead and they were waiting for us in Troas, but we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we joined them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. So simply put here, this team, it's a group of strong leaders from various churches. That would be like leaders today from the Baptist Church, Assemblies of God Church, Calvary Chapel. We all come together and we're on a little mission trip together. Wouldn't that be nice? And we do this to strengthen the churches, the believers in Jerusalem. And we read in other letters of Paul that these men carried and they guarded financial gifts from their own home churches to be presented to the church in Jerusalem that was suffering. It says they stayed for a week for the days of unleavened bread. That was the time of year, the month of April, where the Jews got together to celebrate the Passover. God's delivering Israel from Egypt. Verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them. Since he intended to leave the next day, he continued speaking until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. Okay, so in Troas on Sunday, the believers gathered to remember the Lord's Supper. We call it communion. So the first day of the week is when they met, and the first day of the week was called the Lord's Day because on it the Lord Jesus rose from the dead, and that's also the day the church was born, on the day of Pentecost. And the first day of the week, I want to remind you, was still a work day. It was not the Sabbath. It was not Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. Sunday was a work day. So when the church usually got together on the Lord's Day, it was late afternoon. So that would be us, instead of doing our 10 o'clock thing, we'd come together at 4 or 5 after working all day. They didn't have a church building. So the believers meet in an upstairs room, a large one, belonging to one of the believers there. And by the way, Luke's method of counting days was not Jewish, which measures sundown to sundown, but Roman, that measures midnight to midnight. And we read here that since Paul was heading out the very next morning, he wanted to share as much as he could with these believers, right? And you saw that Paul spoke through dinner all the way till midnight. In other words, he was cramming all the information and encouragement he could into one night. And verse 8 tells us that the room was well lit because they had a whole bunch of oil lamps going to provide light for reading and discussion. And when somebody's talking a long time, and you're sitting and you're listening and you're sitting and you're listening, what begins to happen? You start to nod off. Your head starts to bob. What's not helping matters is that there's oil lamps using up oxygen in the room. There's many bodies also in that room using up oxygen. I'm sure there's insufficient ventilation, and it's I'm sure hot and stuffy. Verse 9, a young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Pause there for a moment. That's actually some humor that in the original Greek language we read. Luke is simply saying one of the younger guys couldn't make himself stay awake no matter what, as Paul just kept going because Paul was long-winded. And we're tempted to imagine that nobody would have fallen asleep while the great apostle Paul was preaching, right? The first recorded operation took place when God created Eve from Adam's body. And a Sunday school teacher quizzed her students about the surgery by asking them how they thought God put Adam to sleep before he operated. And one boy was confident he had the answer, and he said, by preaching a long sermon. One man described preaching as the art of talking in someone else's sleep. A pastor said that when my elders fall asleep while I'm preaching, I just see it as their vote of confidence that I won't say anything heretical. So this young man probably moved towards the window to get some fresh air. And the windows in that part of the world were, they for the most part are today, incredibly wide enough to sit in the opening, draw up your knees, lean against one side. Back to verse 9. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. The poor guy fell sound asleep and toppled out the 3rd-story window. Now, this is one of those things that is not funny, but at the same time kind of is funny. What did the poor guy look like? Did he have broken bones? Was he bleeding out his ears? Thank the Lord somebody noticed that he fell out, and they rushed downstairs. Verse 10, but Paul went down and bending over him, took him in his arms and said, do not be alarmed, for his life is still in him. Now, I hope I could assure the same prognosis for any of you who fall asleep and fall out of your chair during my preaching. That you are only sleeping and you're not dead. By the way, is anybody feeling sleepy right now? Probably not. Okay. Well, down the outside stairs, everybody goes. And when they found the lad senseless, I'm sure they began to shriek and scream, and that's why Paul tells them, stop the fuss. He says his life is still in him. By the way, the name Eutychus, the name of this boy, it means fortunate. The text says that when they picked this young man up, he was dead. So he was killed by the fall. But Paul bends down, kind of gathered Eutychus up in his arms, and he said his life is still in him. Now, was Paul saying that the young man actually wasn't dead? No. Paul was using the familiar words that Jesus did when he raised that young girl to life from the dead. You remember? He entered a house. He said, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. And that's when all the people laughed at him because they knew she was most definitely dead. And then Jesus said, young girl, arise. And then she sat up. Remember, in the New Testament, we see that the church began using the term asleep to describe anybody who had died, who was a Christian. We don't die, we fall asleep, which means if you're asleep, it means one moment you're going to wake up. You're going to be resurrected. It's temporary, your death. So this boy comes back to life, and you know what they did? They got right back to church. Verse 11, then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive, and they were not just a little bit comforted. I want you to notice 3 things here. First, Paul goes right back upstairs, and he carries on. Well, there was no reason not to continue. No need for a trip to the hospital, of course. Second, we read in verse 7 that these Christians originally came together to break bread, literally to share in the Lord's Supper, but they didn't get to that until now. And what more appropriate way to enter in to the Lord's Supper, that communion, then right after this event. Eutychus had done nothing deserving God's help. You might say he had fallen. We've all fallen in Adam. He was dead. We're all dead in sin. And there he was, a young man that was just brought back from death to life by the power of Jesus. And how real and how significant do you think that bread and the wine became for them right there in that upstairs room? They just saw somebody die and come back to life. Third, Paul had all the more reason to keep on encouraging these believers that Jesus was everything that he said he was. So Paul talks with them until dawn. Well, listen, if somebody fell out the window and died and came back to life, we'd all get our second wind too. We'd all be awake. That's a shot of coffee. We'd be up till dawn, no problem. Who can sleep after something like that? Verse 12 tells us that Paul left one way and the people another, taking the young man with them alive, and they were thrilled he was alive. Now, I want you to consider for a moment that the young man thought he could sit in the window and not fall out. And there are those who think they can sit on the skirts of the church and not fall out. Now, whenever my children, when they were young, stood near the edge of something dangerously high, I'd say, get back. You're too close to the edge. And I wonder if somebody in that room told Eutychus that it wasn't a good idea to sit in a window 3 stories high. And we can all be better at warning those among us who are in the window, sitting in the window, to come back towards the center of what's going on. You in the back row, scooting a bit, okay? Ironically, it could be somebody right in the front row, so to speak, who spiritually is sitting in the window and is about to fall asleep. And if by chance somebody falls out of the church, we need to get out there and gather the broken parts of that person and pray in the confidence of Jesus that he's given us for that person to come back to spiritual life. And if you have walked with Jesus for any length of time, you should know by now that God uses all things to work together for the good. He uses people who have fallen out the window, who are then brought back into life, the life of the church, their relationship with Jesus, and they excite the church all the more, just like what happened in this upstairs room for these Christians in Troas. Now, we hate seeing somebody fall out, but we love it even more when we see them come back. But there are no guarantees that a person will come back. So stay away from the window. You shall not tempt the Lord your God. Do not live in such a way that you know is against his laws and think it's not going to harm you. Don't play with fire. That's our tendency. It's because we're stupid. We are hell-bent on rebellion. We find a way to justify what we do. We find a carve-out in our minds, and we expect God to buy it, to agree with us. That God says, well, don't do this, do not do it. But we go, well, but I'm different. I deserve this. Or we're stupid enough to think, actually, God is wrong and we're correct. That we could do this thing and it won't harm us. Anybody as stupid as me out here? You ever been there?
Yes.
I'm going to ask Monty Madison to come up, and he's got a special song he's going to play. I've asked him to sing it. It's a Keith Green song, Asleep in the Light. It's my favorite song he does. And I want to pray with you before he does, and then after he sings, I want to talk to you again, briefly. Okay? Would you pray with me? Father God, we thank you for loving us so much that you gave us both your written word and your living word, your very spirit in us, to speak and to guide and to keep us from falling out. We don't want to fall away from you. We don't want to sleep in the church. We don't want to fall asleep in our relationship with you. To our peril, we play with those things that would cause us to fall to our death. The scriptures, the Savior we hang on to, and we know that what we really need most at this moment is to be touched by you to do that which only you can do and have done for us before, to move so close to us that we will not lose heart, but be strengthened by the truth that your invincible spirit resides in us. And we ask that you would lead us out of temptation and deliver us from evil. as we make sure never to sit in the window of the church.